This video is going to focus on chords and chord progressions. There's lots of things we can talk about with music theory, lots of good stuff you need to know, but can't do it all in one video, so we're going to focus on chords and chord progressions. We're going to start talking about the scale because we have to. It all starts there. But we're going to real quickly get into just chords and how they work and how they function together. So if some of these things here at the beginning of the video seem very basic to you, you already know it, that's great. Maybe you can fast forward, or maybe you need to watch it again just to make sure. But we're going to get to the good stuff pretty soon, trust me. It all starts with the scale. Now, I know you want to jump right in and learn all kinds of cool things about chords and stuff, but it really does start with the scale pattern. And there's lots of scale patterns, and these scales have been around for thousands of years. We find archaeological evidence of them. And the most commonly used scale, of course, is the major scale that I'm sure all of you have heard before. And when you go to choir and they teach you solfege and you have to sing do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, that's what that is. That's the major scale pattern. And so that's where we're going to start. That's the basic beginning point for understanding music theory, understanding where these chords come from. When you're on stage and the bass player is yelling at you to play the 5 chord or the 6 chord, you know what that is because you've studied the scale pattern. So that's where we're going to start. If I play this C and this C, that's an octave. That's called an octave because that's the 8th note of the scale. So there's really 7 notes in the scale before you hit the same note and start all over again and go on up. So, and we're going to take the scale pattern and skip a note, and that's what forms a chord. So since this is the first chord that you can make from that scale pattern, it's really logical. We're going to call it chord number 1. And we use Roman numerals to talk about chords. So this is chord number 1. It's the first chord that I can make from the C major scale, so therefore it's a C major chord. But I can move over to the very next available note in the scale and build a different chord by skipping a note. Guess what? That's the second chord I can make from this scale, so we're going to call it chord number 2. And that's how this works. You just go up the scale with the next available chord. There's chord number 3, chord number 4, chord number 5, 6, 7, and then you're back to where you started from. Since there's 7 notes, there's 7 root notes available to make chords out of. So chord number 1 happens to be a major chord, and we're going to talk more about the difference between major, minor, and diminished and things like that. But the first chord's a major chord. The second chord is a minor chord. The third chord is a minor chord. Chord number 4 and 5 are both major chords. And then chord number 6 is minor. And then 7 is a really weird thing that we call diminished. And we're going to talk about the difference between all of those. So let's stick with those 3 major chords for right now. The first chord is always major when you're playing the major scale. That first chord is major, that 4th chord is major, and that 5th chord is major. And you've probably heard that sound before. So it's just 1, 4, and 5. And those are the 3 chords you need to be familiar with at first when you are studying a key signature, when you're studying a scale, playing in that key according to that scale. You at least need to know the 1 chord and the 4 chord and the 5 chord first. If I go to a different scale, I just went to D major, so there's 1, and there's 4, and there's 5 in the key of D according to the D major scale. So those are the first chords that you need to be familiar with, and we call them the primary chords because they're used so often. You know, your basic folk song or typical simple country song or lots of children's songs. You know, the simplest version of songwriting is going to use the 1 and the 4 and the 5. So you need to know what those are. So as an example, here's like maybe a typical basic country song. You might have the 1 chord and then the 5 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord. So you have 1, 5, 4, back to the 1. So you can see why those are called primary chords. You hear those 3 chords all the time. And as I said before, they're major chords as opposed to minor or diminished. So now we really need to know, well, what's the difference between major, minor, and diminished? So if you play the first chord that's available to you from the major scale, you're playing the first note and the third note and the fifth note of that scale. In this case, I'm playing the C major scale, so therefore the first, third, and fifth note of the C major scale is the C major chord. And the distance between the first note and that third note happens to be 2 whole steps. So you might notice I have, there's a note, there's a note, there's a note, and then there's a note. Each time I play the very next note, that's a half step. And then if I skip a note, it's a whole step. There's another whole step. So the major third is 2 whole steps away from the root note or the first note of the chord. And it's that note that determines whether or not it's major or minor. So if I play the first, third, and fifth note of the major scale, it's a major chord. If I flat it, which means lower it a half step, now I've got a C minor chord. So major, minor, just by changing that middle note. So the reason my second chord in the key of C major, remember as we go up the scale, we're just going to the next available note and the next available chord. That has to be a D minor chord, because remember we're playing the C major scale in this example as we walk up chords. If I were to switch over to the D major scale, then there's my third note, there's my D major chord. Well, obviously that's not what just happened. Back over here in the key of C, when I played that D chord, it's a minor third. It's a half step lower. So therefore that's a D minor chord as opposed to a D major chord. And then as I move up, my next chord is E. My next note is E, so my next chord is some type of E chord. Well, it turns out it's E minor, because if I were to switch over to the other scale, the E scale, it would sound like that. There's my first, third, and fifth note, so that's E major. But coming back over to the key of C, playing the third chord, it's got to be called E minor, because that middle note, instead of G sharp, now it's a G natural. So I'm hoping that that makes sense and you're understanding the difference between major and minor. The deciding factor is that middle note, the note that we call the third. Either it's a minor third or it's a major third. But then what about that weird thing called diminished? So, and remember I told you the 7th chord from the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, is diminished. So it's weird, because not only does it have a minor third where we took the third and we flatted it, brought it down a half step, but we flatted also the 5th. So if I were to play the B major scale, it would sound like that, and therefore my B major chord would sound like that. Well, those two notes don't fit the key of C, and when I play the 7th chord in the key of C, instead of B major, I've brought the third down, minor third, and I've brought the 5th down, flat 5th. And when you have a minor third and a flatted 5th, that's what we call diminished. And so the first chord, the 4th chord, and the 5th chord are major. The 2nd, 3rd, and 6th chord are minor. And the 7th chord is that weird one called diminished, which quite frankly doesn't get used that often in most forms of music. You use a lot of diminished chords in jazz, but not too many other forms of music. So 7 notes of the scale, 7 chords that come from the scale. Now we're going to talk about how to use those chords in chord progressions. So, hey Barry.
Yeah.
Let's play 1, 4, and 5. Pick a key.
1, 4, and 5. Okay, if I go to the key of G, that's the natural guitar player key. I've got a G chord, which is a 1. In the key of G, G is a 1. C is 4. D is 5.
So 1, 4, and 5 are the primary chords. The next most important chord after 1, 4, and 5 would have to be the 6th chord. That gets used quite a bit, and you've probably heard, this chord progression. Okay, and there was the 6th chord in the middle of that. You had the 1 going to the 5, and then you hear the 6th chord right there going to the 4. It's been used a lot, and I'm sure you've heard that before, or probably even 1 going to 6, and then a 4 to a 5. I bet you've heard that one before. 1, 6, 4, 5. Gets used a lot. So after 1, 4, and 5, the three primary chords, you'd have to say that the 6th chord is the next most commonly used chord. So lots of songs will use actually only those 4 chords. There's lots of hit songs that only use the 1, 4, 5, and 6. So now that you know those 4 chords, you're ready to write your hit song. You know, after the 6th chord, probably the next most commonly used chord would be the 2 chord. So I hear lots of 2 going to 5, taking you back over to the 1, which is something we're going to talk about later on. But since 2, 5, 1 is such a formula, gets used a lot, that 2 chord becomes pretty important. Another chord progression that I hear a lot is the 1 going to the 2, and then walk up to the 4, going to the 5. I hear that quite a bit. So after 1, 4, 5, and 6, the next commonly used chord would have to be the 2 chord. And that leaves us with the 3 chord and then the 7. So the 3 chord, it doesn't get used as much as those other chords. It gets used occasionally. Amarillo by Morning was a big country hit that George Strait cut back in the early 80s. And it's in the key of D, and it uses that 3 chord going to the 4 chord and the 5. And so there's a famous song right there that made good use of the 3 chord, the 3 minor chord. 3 chord going to the 4 takes you right into that 5 chord. So then the last chord, that funny little diminished chord, the 7 chord, doesn't get used very often.
And in the scale, we were talking about the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, and the 6. Well, I'm only going to go to 6 for now because that's all this song has. You've all heard the old folk song and hymn, Amazing Grace. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 4, 4, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1, 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 1, 6 minor, 5, 4, 1. Is that right? Amazing grace. Here comes the 4. How sweet the sound. Back to the 1. That one saved a wretch like 5. Me, I once was lost, but for now I'm found. Was 6 minor blind, but 5 now I see. Yeah.
I bet everybody's heard this one before. That's a 1 chord to the 5 chord. But then, interesting, that's the 6 to the 3. There's the 4 chord, back to the 1, back to the 4, and then the 5 again. And then we repeat the whole thing, and I bet you're recognizing this chord progression by now. So that was 1 and 5. Here's 6 to a 3, and then 4, 1, 4, and 5. 1 to 5, 6 to 3, 4, 1, 4, back to 5. And you just start all over again. So Pachelbel wrote that in the late 1600s. Pachelbel, by the way, is the guy who taught J.S. Bach. And so this would have been a composer that J.S. Bach would have looked up to. And here he's given us this classic example. And every time these chords roll by, some different melodic statement occurs. And it's almost like he's inviting you, now that you've played this whole piece and you've played all these little things that I've come up with, it's your turn. Take these chords and do your own thing with them. It's almost like he's inviting us to do that. But it's a classic chord progression that we still hear examples of today. I hear little pieces of this Pachelbel progression in other songs because, you know, good chord progression never dies, right? So we've been talking about taking the major scale and playing chords from that major scale. So since there's 7 notes, there's 7 chords that come from those notes. But now we need to talk about what's known as the relative minor. For every major key, which means every major scale, there is a relative minor. It's always the 6th note of the major scale that tells you what the relative minor is. So I'm playing a G major. G, A, B, C, D, E is the 6th note. So if I start playing this same scale but start on E, now I'm playing E minor. And E minor, as you can see, is the relative minor to G major. Because they're the exact same notes, it's just a different starting note for that same scale pattern. So G major and E minor are relatives of each other because they're the same scale. So now if I'm playing an E minor, my 1 chord is E minor, and my 4 chord would be A minor, and my 5 chord would be B minor. Sounds a lot different than if I were playing in a major key. 1, 4, 5, 1. But a long time ago, people decided that they had a problem with the 5 chord sounding like that. That's kind of bumming me out. I wish this 5 chord sounded like that. And so they decided that the 5 chord really should be major, even if we're in a minor key. Well, in order to do that, I have to change this note, the 7th note of the minor scale, because that's the note that makes the 5 chord minor. I've got to change that and raise it up here. Oh, now that's much better. Now my 5 chord is major and everybody's happy. And it takes you right back to the 1 chord. So when they do that, when they take the 7th note of the minor scale and they change it and sharp it up a half step, so it sounds like that, that's what's known as the harmonic minor scale. It's an alteration of the original minor scale. So if you play the minor scale, when it's the way it's just like the major scale, it's relative major, then you call that the natural minor. If you alter it and you sharp that 7th note, that's what's known as the harmonic minor scale. So I'm telling you all of this for a reason, because this has an effect on how we play chords in a minor key. So if I'm playing an E minor is 1, A minor is 4, B minor could be 5, but probably in most cases we're going to play B major instead, and now I'm using that harmonic minor note, that sharp 7, so that I can have a major 5 chord. So when you hear which everybody's heard before, so now I'm in A minor, and of course in A minor it's a relative minor to C major. If I want my 5 chord to be major, I've got to sharp that 7th note and play a G sharp instead of a G natural. And so that's what Beethoven did, of course. There's the A minor chord, and then he goes to the E major chord, and there's my G sharp. Sharp 7, back to the 1 chord, the A minor. And so that's common in music. Most of the time when you're in a minor key, that 5 chord is going to appear major. Here's another famous example. I'm going to go back to E minor now, and I bet you've heard this. That's E minor, D major, C major, and B major. 5 chord appearing major once again with the harmonic minor note. So E minor, D major, C major, B major, 5 chord appearing major, back to the 1 chord. Now what's really cool about this song is now for the chorus, it goes to the relative major, the G major, and there's that melody note way up there, and there's the D major again, C major, and B major, there's the major 5 chord. But for the chorus, it's got to be more uplifting, so we go to the relative major, G major, C major, B major, the 5 chord, back to the E minor, the 1 chord. So you needed to know about the natural minor scale and the harmonic minor scale in order to know how to make chords using the minor scale. So I'm in the key of C. There's my 1 chord. I'm going to play a chord progression, see if you can recognize the numbers. So there's the first chord I played. Happens to be the 6 chord. That's the 2 chord. There's our 5 chord with some extra notes added to it, but it's 5. Going back to the 1. So you've got 6, 2, 5, 1. So if I just played them straight, A minor is 6, D major is 2, but I've obviously changed the key signature because it should be D minor for those of you that have been paying attention. But now I'm playing the 2 chord major, and there's our 5, which is G, back to the 1, which is C. But that sounds kind of boring, so we can put some extra little extension tones to make it more interesting. But the basic chord progression is still 6, 2, 5, 1, and you can hear that in the bass. The whole 6, 2, 5, 1. There's a reason why that chord progression gets used a lot. It's a musical formula. It's a musical cliche. It happens all the time. And that's because there's something very special about the resolution going from a 5 chord to a 1 chord. You've heard that sound many times. There's the 5 chord with the 7 on it. 5, G7, resolving to a C major. And our ear just really likes the sound of 5 to 1. Happens all the time in music. And because of that, the 2 chord sounds really good in front of the 5. And if you think about it, you'll realize why. Because in this case, the 2 chord, D minor, D is 5 away from G, which is our 5 chord, back to 1. So the 2 chord is kind of like the 5 of the 5. 2, 5, 1. Well, if that's true, I could probably keep this thing going. What would set up the 2 chord? What would be the 5 of the 2 in a manner of speaking? Well, that of course would be the 6 chord. 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, down to the D, sets up the 2 chord. 6 to 2, the 2 sets up the 5 sets up the 1. So what you've got is a series of 5 to 1 resolutions. A minor is 5 to D minor is 5 to G is of course 5 to C. So there's that whole 5 to 1 rule happening once again. And it appears in this piece. So what just happened there? You've probably heard that before. It's Bach. It's a Bach prelude. So the first chord, C major, there's our 1 chord. There's the next chord, it's D minor 7, it's the 2 chord. That's the G7, it's 5, back to the 1. And then he does something else to just illustrate the point further. A minor, which is 6, 7, which is 2, but it appears major this time, which really makes you want to go now to the G, which is of course the 5 chord, which takes you right back to C, which is the 1 chord. So Bach is giving us 1, he starts on the 1, establishes the key, and then he goes 2, 5, 1, and then he goes 6, 2, 5, 1. So in the first 8 measures of the Bach Prelude number 1 in C, he's giving us this basic music theory lesson about the importance of 5 resolving to 1.
That makes no sense at all. But okay, if we've been talking about the basic structures of like 1, 4, 5, 6 minor, or like 1, 2 minor, 5, and 4 in some of the traditional structures of songs, but there are always those funny little curves that get thrown. Like for instance, if you were playing, let's just say you were playing a song in D, and so D's the 1, E minor's the 2 minor, G is your 4. So say you've got a song that's going along like this. Da, 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 da. Oh, no, no, no. Oh, no, no, no. Da, 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 da. But then what happens if all of a sudden there's an E major? So all of a sudden you've changed the flavor a little bit. Instead of using the 2 minor, you're using the 2 major. The whole time the song you've been doing that with the minor and the 4 and all the usual stuff, but then you throw a curve. It's and I said so it's a nice little way to bend a song. Sometimes you're using some of the same melody notes, but they change the chord underneath. So you will hear stuff like that. Or say you're in that key, in that same key. Say you're doing the 1, the 6 minor, the G, which is the 4, and the A, which is the 5. Just back and forth like D minor, G, that's a 4, back to the 1. But then what if all of a sudden there was what they call the flatted 7th? Oh boy, that sounds fancy. Oh, sorry. That's actually a more common form to be used. Flatted 7, C, G, 4, D. Flatted 7, 4, and 1. So you hear a lot of songs that do have that, but sometimes they try to put it in a real strategic place for emphasis or for just a little change. So. That's a 1, a 2, a 4, a 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 4, 6 minor, down, and then 4 minor. form of 1 major, 4 minor, 1, 5, and a regular 4 major, 4 minor. So you get you see how that kind of changes, creates a little mood switch there, a little extra interesting. You'll find in melodies sometimes they're singing a note across both the chords, the major, or you'll hear a move. So it's just kind of a nice little, that's an extra little exception to the rule of your 1, 4, 5, 6 minor.
One of the cool things that I like about the 4 minor, and I believe this is why we like the sound of the 4 minor so much. You know, let's say you're playing the 1, I'm in the key of G now, so G is 1, and you go to C major, which of course is 4. I can play it up here, there's your 4 major. But that note, the major third, drops down a half step, and it takes you to that note, which is the 5th of the 1 chord. So you've got this chromatic movement, and that's why I believe we like the sound of the 4 minor so much. 4 major, 4 minor chromatic movement, back to the 1 chord, 1 chord, 4 major, 4 minor, back to the 1. It's one of my favorite little tricks to pull out, the old 4 minor trick. So I thought this would be as good of a place as any to talk about the blues. Blues has influenced every form of music in America since the early 1900s. In fact, you wouldn't have jazz, you wouldn't have rock and roll unless you first had the blues. Muddy Waters wrote a song that was entitled "The Blues Had a Baby," and they called it rock and roll, and he was just telling a true story when he wrote that. So let's talk about the chord progression, the primary chord progression that makes up the blues form. What we're talking about is something that's 12 measures long, the 12-bar blues. So I'm in the key of G, so I'm going to play the 1 chord for 4 measures. There's the 2nd measure, and there's the 3rd measure, here's the 4th measure. Now I'm going to go to the 4 chord for 2 measures, and then I'm going to go back to the 1 chord for 2 more measures. And then we got to go to the 5 chord, here's the 5, back down to the 4, and then the 1 chord, and then lastly the 5 chord, and then we start all over again. So there's your 12 measures, the 12-bar blues. You got 4 measures of 1, 2 measures of 4, back to 2 measures of 1, and then you have to go 5, 4, 1, 5, and you might notice that I'm doing something besides just playing a plain old chord, the 1 chord with the root note, the 3rd, and the 5th. I'm adding an extra note known as the 7th, the flatted 7th, or the dominant 7th. And that's the thing about the blues. Every chord gets that 7th tone added to it. It gives it that bluesy sound. Bach would have never thought of doing that. It would have broken all the rules of classical music theory. But you put that 7 on there, and now you got something that sounds a little bluesy. You even do it to the 4 chord. There's the 7 again on the 4 chord. And back to the 1, and you do it, of course, to the 5, back to the 4, and then the 1. So there's your basic blues form right there. But there's variations of it. Like I might go to the 4, back to the 1. There's my first 4 measures. Here's my 4 chord. Back to the 1. 5, 4, 1. It might stay on the 1 and not go to the 5 at the very end. There's little variations of that. Sometimes before you go to the 5, you might go to a sharp 5. There's another variation. You might hear that in a blues song. But then the other thing we have to talk about that's like the coolest part of the story is the blues scale. If I took what's known as the minor pentatonic scale, root note, minor 3rd, 4, the 5th, and the flatted 7th, the old pentatonic scale, and I add an extra note to it, the flat 5, now I got a blues scale. And with that scale, sometimes rock and rollers will take notes from that scale and they'll make chords off of those root notes. And then their song is based on chords that are coming from notes of the blues scale. And that's kind of makes it sound more like edgy rock and roll. So any good rock and roll has to have its roots in the blues, and that's just one more example of it. So if I wanted to go down here and come back up, well, that's just a chord based on another blues note. G down to F and back to, or I could go F, C, G. Again, those are chords based on notes from the blues scale. If I were just in the key of G playing classical music theory, you wouldn't have an F chord. It doesn't fit the key, but it does fit the key if you're thinking blues. And that's where all good rock and roll comes from.
Let's just do a little pretend song for a minute. A, C, D, E, G, A. Now it sounds probably kind of like some of the stuff you've heard before, the basic guts of how that kind of stuff works. This is also kind of the basis of what they call the blues scale. Rock and roll and contemporary rock music came from this pentatonic scale, which was being used in sort of more old-fashioned blues, like in old blues in the 40s and 50s. The electric guitar blues was started to just kick off, and that was very influential in starting electric guitar off as a rock instrument. So when you hear lead guitar, and when you hear people improvising and making up their lead solos, they're doing what we call boxes or shapes on the fretboard, and those almost always follow some sort of range that hovers around the pentatonic scale. Those are pentatonic scales. Basically, that's your 5-note scale going by, sometimes at blinding speed, and then every now and then you've got a guy that wants to do it, and he's using just some notes from the middle of the scale to make a little sort of diddly thing. So that's A, the 1, and then minor 3rd and 4th. Now there is one accidental note in there that's not part of the regular pentatonic, but everything else in there is in that scale.
It's the blues note.
It's the blue note.
It's the flat.
1, 3 minor, 4. Oh, what was that? Now we have the ooh. That's when the bad guy's fixing to bust in the door and get you in trouble. That's the blue note, or it's actually a flatted 5th. So now we have a 6-note scale, more blues. So that's A, C, D, D sharp or E flat, E, G. There's about 300 songs that go like that.
So I've got a minor pentatonic scale now. If I add one note to that scale, and there it is right there, I'm going to call that the flat 5. So I've got a starting note, 1, then I've got a minor 3rd, and then I've got a 4, a flat 5, a 5, a flat 7, and now I've got the blues scale. Okay, what can we do with that? We can build chords from that. What if I just took 3 notes from that scale, the first 3 notes, and I put major triads on top of those 3 notes? Sounds a little like rock and roll, and in fact that's where classic rock comes from, is notes from the minor pentatonic or the blues scale, including that note. Or all those classic rock riffs start with this idea of the minor pentatonic or the blues scale. Lots of rock and roll comes right from that scale.
So if you're going to use major chords, but use that shape of the pentatonic movement, you'd be going like A major, C major, D major, E major. It's almost a little bit more like sort of garage rock from the 60s, you know? So that's A, C, D, E. That's A, C, and D. You recognize that little thing? Here's the first 3 notes of the G blues scale, playing a chord pattern you might recognize.
So at this point, we need to talk about more complicated chords, because during that segment on the blues you might have noticed that I was throwing in a 7th, and I even called it that, where you take a major triad and you add this extra note to it. That's the 7th. And we talked about that when we were talking about blues progressions. So let's talk more about 7ths, 9ths, 11ths, 13ths, notes that you can add onto a triad to make a more complicated and colorful chord. But before we talk about that, we kind of have to clarify the different types of triads. We've been talking about a major triad and a minor triad and then a diminished triad. Just for the record, you could also take this triad 1, 3, 5, and instead of the 3rd you could play the 4th instead. So you have a 1, a 4, and a 5, and that's what they call a suspended 4th chord. If I took the 3 and I moved it down to the 2 instead, and I had 1, 2, and 5, well, we're going to call that a suspended 2nd chord. So some people might, like I'm playing a C, a D, and a G, a C2. Some people might call that a C2, or you could call it a suspended 2nd. So another thing you could do is maybe take that 5th and sharp it. 1, 3, and a sharp 5, and they call that sharp 5, or augmented is another word for that chord. So all of those are 3-note chords, so they're triads. So if I take my major triad and I add the real 7th note of the scale onto my major triad, the proper term for that is a major 7th chord, and that's different than if I flat that 7 and add that to the major triad. That's what they call just a 7, like a C7, but it's really a flatted 7. The terminology doesn't tell you that. And just to make it more complicated, what happens if I take a minor chord and I add that flatted 7th to it? The proper term for that is C minor 7. And I know that that's not consistent, because when I said C major 7th, the major 7 was referring to the 7. But now when I say minor 7, the word minor is referring to the minor 3rd, and the 7 is the flatted 7th. So you just kind of have to memorize that terminology. It's inconsistent with itself. So a major chord with the real 7 is a major 7. If I put a flatted 7 on it, it's just called a 7, like a C7. If I take the minor chord, put the flatted 7th on it, they call that a minor 7. Let's say we're in the key of G major, of course, has an F sharp there. And so we talked about this, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7th triad of the scale. So which 7 is the right 7 to use, and we're going to talk about that. So for the 1 chord, I'm going to use a major 7th. See, these are all going to be how to use the 7ths and keep it inside of the key signature that you're in. So the 1 chord would typically then use the major 7th. The 2 chord is minor, and it would have a dominant 7. See, that's not the real 7th to A, it's actually a flatted 7th. So the 2 and the 3 would also use the flatted 7th. Here's our 4 chord. It's going to use the major 7th to stay inside of the key signature. But the 5 chord can't use the major 7th. It's going to be the flatted 7th, the dominant 7th, in order to stay inside the key signature. Here's our 6. Minor chord uses the flatted 7th. And the 7th chord, of course, is a diminished triad with a minor 3rd, a flat 5. And it's going to also use the, not the major 7th, but the flatted 7th in order to stay inside the key signature. So only 2 of those chords, the 1 chord, use the major 7th. There's the 1 chord, and here's the 4 chord. All the other chords, the 2, the 3, and the, of course, 5, and the 6, and the diminished 7th, they all use the dominant 7, the flatted 7th.
In piano, since it's very linear and you're able to just kind of look at things in a very logical line, that's one thing. When you're looking at it on a guitar, it's a little bit different, so your logic of the whole thing is a little bit different. So usually, more often than not, you're just memorizing shapes of chords. Like, and almost any time, like for instance, if you have a chord like a G chord, you're playing a normal G chord on a guitar. If you want to play the major 7, that's if you go 8 steps above, an octave above your root note, your bottom note G, go down a half a step, you're at what you call the major 7th. That's an F sharp. So you've just made that into a major 7 chord. If you're going to make it a 7th, go down another half a step. There's your G7. So G major 7. G major 7, G7. That's your regular A minor chord. If you pick up your ring finger, you've added the G note to it, which is a 7th. But you can actually give it a little bit more weight on that by fingering the G note way down here at the bottom. Your standard E minor. Pick up your ring finger. That's an E minor 7th. You've done a 7th, okay? Another way to do it is this chord here. Play your E minor fingered like that, but put your ring finger here on the 2nd string, 3rd fret. The voice is a little bit different. It puts that 7th up higher. See, you got your root note E, got your 7th up here.
It would be unusual to have a minor chord, like I just took the A minor, the 2 chord there in my key of G. It'd be very unusual to have a minor triad with a major 7th on it, although it does get used sometimes, and in fact, that's a sound you might have heard before in a James Bond movie or some movie where something very suspenseful is happening, and that's the chord that they would use, a minor triad with a major 7 on top. Kind of has that spy James Bond sound to it. So after that, we have to talk about 9ths and 11ths. So if I played that chord, I could call that a G9. I could call that a G major 9 because it has the major 7th and the 9th on it. But a lot of times it's just going to be adding the 9th right here. And so I've got the 1, the 3, and the 5, and I'm going to add the 9th there, and it sounds like that. And it's kind of a nice sounding way to color a chord just by adding the 9th to it. So it's a G chord, but it's got an added 9th tone to it. So another cool thing is, you might have heard this in some music that kind of sounds more like gospel music. Here's a C chord. And what happens if, let's say I'm in the key of G. Here's my 1 chord, here's my 5 chord, D, here's my 4 chord. But what happens if when I go to the 5 chord, I want a 5 in the bass, but I want the 4 chord on top of it? Kind of sounds cool. It's another way of playing the 5. And you hear that in gospel music a lot of times, that kind of a 5 chord. And so if you think about it, it's really like playing the 7 and the 9th and the 11th on top of the 5 chord. Right? I'm just leaving those two notes out. So you might see that notated on a piece of music, though, as a C chord with a D in the bass. But it's an alteration of the 5 chord with some really cool extension tones. Another way of playing the 5 chord. And another example I can think of is a flat 9. And a lot of times the flat 9 is used when you're playing a 5 chord and you got the 7 on there, and of course that dominant 7 adds tension, makes it want to resolve to the 1 chord. Right, but you could take that and go on up to another note that I'm going to call the flat 9 and really add some tension to this chord. And now it wants to resolve to the G even more. So I've got the D7, there's my dominant 7, there's my flat 9. Boy, that just sounds like it's full of tension, and it really needs to go there to resolve that tension. But something I've noticed about that chord is if I took this root note out and I looked at this chord, it's kind of cool. That's a fully diminished triad. I've got a minor third and a flat 5, and then I've got a double flatted 7 that makes it fully diminished. It's just something I noticed about the flat 9 chord. I could play it that way. If the bass player played the F sharp, then I'd have to call that F sharp diminished. If the bass player plays a D, then I have to call it D7 flat 9. But either way, both of those chords want to take you back to the G. It's just a way of establishing some more tension. One more example would be the sharp 9 chord. I like this chord. It kind of sounds cool. So here's a D7 once again, and instead of a regular 9, I'm going to sharp the 9, and now it sounds like that. So what it looks like is happening is I've got a minor third on top of a major third. Boy, that's weird. How can you put a minor third on top of a major third? They usually don't go together. But in this case, I'm going to call it a sharp 9, and it's another way of adding tension to that chord. You can find that chord in the song Taxman by the Beatles. That's the Taxman chord. So I'm just going to go through a chord progression. You might recognize it. And then call out the chords, and you'll see uses of different extension tones in this chord progression. So I'm just going to start with something real simple and basic. That's just an F major chord. Then the next chord would be an A7 chord. So I've got my A major chord with a dominant 7 on top of it. Now I'm going to play a D minor 7 with a C bass. Now a G chord with a B bass. Now a B flat minor chord. And now an A minor 7 chord. And then a D 7 chord. I just put that melody note up on top. Now I've got G minor 7 to a C7. Now I've got A minor 7 to a F sharp diminished, but I could also have gone from that A minor 7 to a D7 sharp 9. Once again, if I take that root note away, it becomes an F sharp fully diminished, or I could call it a D7 flat 9. Either way, it's the next chord after the A minor 7. D7 flat 9, which makes us want to go to G7, which takes us to a C. But this time on the C, I'm going to augment the 5th. That augmented 5th takes me right back to the melody note of the 1 chord, the F chord, as we go back through the verse again. There's my G chord to my B flat minor chord, A minor 7, D7, G minor 7, C chord. And here's my option again. I could play an F chord, or I could play a A minor 7 to D7 flat 9. There's my D7 flat 9, which which takes me to G chord. I think that'd sound better as a minor though. And that really makes me want to hear the C chord, but what's cool is, once again, the augmented fifth. So there's different ways you can do this for different reasons. The reason you'd want to use that augmented fifth is not only to add extra tension to this 5 chord, but also because it's going to resolve a half step up to the melody note of the next phrase. It's one reason why you might want to use that chord. You could have just played a regular old C7. It takes you right to the F just the same. It works as well.
We're going to talk a little bit about sharp 5, sharp fifths, or sometimes called augmented chords. If we have an A chord, let's take the top 3 notes of an A chord. We got A, C sharp, and E, and that's the first, the third, and the fifth. Okay, an augmented fifth takes that highest one. In this case, it's an E, moves it up a half a step. So you go from your basic A chord to, and you move that up a half step to give it that. Again, like Mark was saying, that's some tension in that to make it help move to another thing. But you may have heard it in an old gospel type song. So that was an F sharp chord, but we took the thing, we changed it. That's just F sharp. And that's F sharp with the raised fifth, the augmented. Very, very nicely. You'll hear that a lot in gospel music. You'll hear it sometimes substituted for diminished chords or things that pass between, a lot of times at the end of a phrase, like you'll have like a little blues song. I'm in E here, E7, and then B, and then B. Moves that little thing up and gets it ready to go back to your root chord. So that's your augmented fifth.
Right. I hope this video has been helpful to you. Explained some things you didn't know about chords before, filled in some gaps in your information, maybe even help you with your songwriting, help you to read chord charts, help you to play by ear, listen to what other people are doing, and be able to jump in with them. Most important thing, though, is to have fun.